Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. All right, friends and familiars. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a versatile author of both poetry and prose. He's joining me today to discuss his recent sci-fi horror short story collection entitled In Those Fading Stars. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Andrew Najberg. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Twitch, and X with Andrew Najberg talking about his new collection of short stories entitled In Those Fading Stars. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, man, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I should say welcome. Did I say welcome back to the show? Because that's what I meant. This is like the third time, I think, right?
Yeah, it is actually.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me once again on this 9th day of September 2024. I was well aware of your literary prowess from your two previous novels, so I was really looking forward to reading some of your short fiction. And as a fan of dystopian sci-fi, especially tech noir, I really enjoyed the skilled addition of horror and grief horror. The stories were dark, soul-crushing, bizarre, and sometimes humorous, but always compelling and deeply dystopian. So thank you for sending me a copy, and thank you once again for joining me on the show.
Oh, I'm absolutely delighted to. Thank you for checking it out. From our prior conversations, I'll admit I was really excited to send you a piece of science fiction.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I could tell from the Mobius Door, especially. I was like, he's got that in him to go just full throttle sci-fi. So I want to see what's going to happen here.
Oh, I grew up reading science fiction, and so actually this is the first genre I wanted to publish in, and some reason the horror stories just came more easily. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, the first story, entitled Before You Fade Away, you tell the story of a father whose son is dependent on his father's life force to remain alive. Otherwise, he fades away. So, how was the son's condition related to his mother dying during childbirth? Was this a sci-fi premise, or was it metaphorical in some way? Because I couldn't quite figure out exactly what was happening. Was he making contact with the boy to transfer some sort of a life force, or?
Yeah, so it is a process of physical contact. There's an element of almost, for lack of a better term, there is an almost magical element of it, sort of an old story of literally being so intensely invested in trying to do something that you kind of will it into being. About the mother, though, the story doesn't speculate on it directly, but my take on it has been that the developing fetus was also draining the life of the mother, just in a less visible way. So once he's born, of course, he no longer has that source of sustenance, and then the father has to take over.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
it is definitely a fairly metaphorical piece. It's actually, I would call it the most personal piece in the entire collection. And interestingly, it's the last piece I wrote. About a year and a half ago now, we had a rather disturbing incident that sort of very strongly disrupted our family. And the piece was written in the immediate aftermath of that. And it was, in a lot of ways, it was sort of a point where I'm the kind of person who, like, I try to do it all. I'm very, I have a full time job, I have the sort of primary income of the household. I have a secondary income from writing, and so I have a major kind of a second job, really. And then I also do a very significant amount of the caregiving as well. And I really do try to be as involved and invested in the whole family as I possibly can. And so for a while there, it really felt like I was literally doing absolutely everything possible, and everything was going kind of really good with the family. And having something kind of come to us out of left field that was entirely beyond our control really, really struck me with just how impossible it is to truly protect the people that you care about. That there's always going to be something that you can't manage or you can't prevent. And that was a major impetus, a feeling that I was trying to bring out in that story was that, even if you're literally giving your own life, there's only so long that that can sustain itself. In a lot of ways, it was a bit of a healthy wake up call where I was like, I need to kind of pay attention to how I'm able to handle everything I'm trying to take on right now.
So was it ultimate, and you don't have to get into all the details, but like, was it ultimately something that you just had to learn to be uncomfortable with, or was there like a happy resolution?
No, there's no happy resolution, and it's actually still an ongoing situation. And we'll be hopefully seeing an end to it next May. But it's an ongoing process that the family is dealing with, and it's certainly a strain and an emotional hardship for sure. But it's also something that we've been substantially able to, I think, build our life moving forward. Away from.
And I'm assuming this is probably a good example of a writer using writing for catharsis.
Yeah, I like to say that a lot of my short fiction is things out of my life just taken one step to the left. I like to, as you mentioned in your intro, I do write things that are often absurd, often really dark, sometimes downright just bizarre. But at the same time, one of my goals in storytelling is also to always ground those more exotic elements in something that I would call deeply human. I typically try to bring to the forefront what I feel to be truths about some of the fundamental relationships we experience. And so, Before You Fade Away, for example, really is about about fatherhood, about a father trying to protect a child. There's also some elements looking at as well, maternity and things like that too. But really, it was specifically trying to isolate that one particular relationship.
Gotcha. Well, your next story, entitled Do You Read, has a very interesting premise in that robots are exploring the aftermath of human civilization. And a big part of the story is the robot's fascination with dreams. And so that's one of the things when it comes to like AI and robots, like even now, before all the whole obsession with AI and robotics and stuff like that, there was, at least in philosophical circles, there was an obsession with what consciousness actually is. You've got panpsychism, then you've got the physicalism, then you've got, you know, there's a few other theories, but those seem to be the main two. Uh, so, were you attempting to express through this story the belief that the artificial intelligence that a robot would have would still not be as complex as human consciousness? And what are your beliefs in that respect? And one thing I can't quite remember, what was it that they were obsessed with as far as the dreams go in the context? Wasn't it like some sort of cloud that held dreams or something like that?
Yeah. A couple of things about that. Of course, this is an example of one of the pieces where I do use a little bit of absurdity and a little bit of humor in it as part of the representation. But it's also a piece that I think the humor is really meaningful to its overall message. So I'll kind of break that down in pieces. When we talked about the Mobius Door quite a while back, one of the things that we discussed was the way in which Mobius Door treats the idea of consciousness as almost a three-dimensional universe in and of itself. And so you have these images of the characters who are being, pushed off to the side of their own universe, and then their psyche dominated by these overtaking psychic forces, for lack of a better term. And so, one of the things that I do play with here is underneath it that I do think that the human mind is very much its own universe. I think I find it fascinating when I read studies about things like quantum measurements, where they determine that it is in fact quantifiable that we perceive different realities. So it's not just something that is purely subjective. They've been able to find ways to minutely measure objective differences in subjective points of view. And so part of what I am playing with here is that, really to me, I don't think our experience of time can ever cease. I definitely do subscribe to the theory when our consciousness fails, or our bodies fail, I should say, that there is an extent to which we just perceive infinitely smaller sequences of time. And so we, in a way, somebody who died 1,000 years ago is still experiencing their death in its own way, just on a divergent timeline from our own. Now, to come to sort of that larger question about things like, the ending question about the cloud.
Nobody understands the cloud.
Well, typically speaking, and especially things like cartoonish representations, comics and things like that. Our afterlife is often described as, sort of being among the clouds. Our consciousness is described as having your head in the clouds. And to a certain extent, these robots are misunderstanding some very simple information. That's, it's just like they don't understand the nuance of ritual when they're drawing the pentagram. They think it's the exact shades of color that matter, not necessarily the use of blood or something more arcane. And finally, when it comes to whether they're inadequate or not as sophisticated, I really don't see them as more or less than. I'm more going for that they are always going to be different. It's kind of like when you ask an AI program to generate a piece of art. You get some really interesting differences in how the ideas are processed and expressed. And so to me, these robots they could be every bit as sophisticated and intelligent as the human brain. It's just, I do think that it would be a different form of intelligence. It would process the world in different ways. It wouldn't have necessarily the same kind of associative or emotional reactions that we would. It'd be something fundamentally different. And finally, one of the things there's an undertone of the story where the robots also, at least to me, represent generational gaps. You have the human generation, which is sort of this older, more archaic generation that's going away, and the robots are the new, younger generation that's taking over. And for the most part, they're doing their own newer generation thing. They're rebuilding the world in their own image and trying to make of it what they want to. But they still also do have a curiosity for where they came from, what the world looked like to those past generations. It's kind of like when I'm reading, science fiction by, some older author like Arthur C. Clarke or Asimov or something like that. And, one thing that always stands out to me when you look at the 50s, 60s, and 70s of science fiction is just how hopeful they were. And of course, they had their own sets of problems as well. And you see that reflected in their work. You see Foundation, the fear of crumbling empires. You see in Clarke tons of, examinations of like human strife and failure. But at the same time, we had those sort of shining silver city optimism that, you get out of some of those really classic movies and things like that. And you look from contemporary science fiction, and we don't see the future in that way. Even our hopeful versions of the future aren't quite that same polished silver shining city. It's our, even then, it's our own version of what a hopeful future would be. And so that's something I was playing with in these robots, is that they're never going to quite get it, and it's not because they're lesser than; it's just because they're different, and they're their own thing.
Mhm. So when I start thinking back, like my brain kind of stopped at like 1980, like Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm.
So like, which I forget the name of the novel that was adapted
An
from.
android's dream of electric sheep.
Yeah, there you go. Uh, I'm just trying to figure out, was there like a point in time where science fiction just got dystopian?
Alien.
Alien?
Yeah.
So what was that, was 1980 something, right?
No, 1979.
1979.
Yeah,
Okay.
Scott was the one who introduced the what's now been called the lived-in future, where if you look at the comparison, the jump from 2001: Space Odyssey by Kubrick into Alien, that was one of the things that was really jarring to a lot of audiences about Alien. Actually, they saw that patient, methodical science fiction pace. You have the panoramic shots of these really bizarre ground formations that you're examining, like the derelict spacecraft and things like that. And then, bam, Kane is on the table with the alien erupting out of his chest. But audiences had been thinking in terms of science fiction about that kind of, that much more patient, careful, low key storytelling in 2001. And in that one, of course, everything is meticulously clean. Everything is shining in the spacecraft. Hal is represented by concentric circles with the bright, lush, glowing center. You have the
Total
exercise
Kubrick.
wheel. Yeah, exactly. But then, yeah, Ridley Scott really brought it in a different direction. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that it's highly possible that other films had depicted sort of more rundown futures, but I think Scott and Alien is the one that really brought that into the public consciousness. And then it makes sense that, Scott would then follow it with Blade Runner, which furthers the vision.
I guess maybe when I say dystopian, I might be utilizing the term in the wrong way. What I meant was like a bleak future.
Mhm.
Like when did, because I mean, even in 2001, I mean, that's an example. That's kind of like a Black Mirror example
That's
of
fair.
a conscious agent. Like, I'm afraid I can't do that. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Okay. The future's not looking bright anymore,
Well,
type of thing.
maybe we could look at something like Philip K. Dick or, Harlan Ellison and I Have No Mouth, But I Must Scream. We definitely see seeds of that. I think in the modern terms, I'd probably say Neuromancer is the one that really sort of brought the dystopian science fiction into sort of an updated contemporary era. But before that, film wise, at least, I would still probably stick to sort of the popular vision coming from Alien, but then we see it in, heck, look at Clans of the Alphane Moon by Philip K. Dick. I don't know if you've read that one, but
Mm-mm.
it's delightful. It's about a planet, or a moon, who's basically been used as a massive insane asylum, and it's separated into nations, according to one's insanity. And so,
Oh, God.
yeah, and then
That sounds fantastic.
the main character gets shipped off there with a telepathic Ganymedian slime mold named Lord Running Clam.
Uh-huh.
It's a really wild book. It's one of my favorites of Dick's.
Well, this kind of is a good segue into the next question as far as people being relocated, different things going on in different planets. Your next story, entitled Honeymoon, is about a young couple going on a honeymoon on a budget. And it's in the future, so they're going to the distant reaches of space through an inexpensive yet somewhat dangerous process that's referred to by, and I believe it's an acronym, BEEV, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, can you kind of give us a brief rundown of what Beeve is and the customers, and what happens to the customers who are very cleverly referred to as beavers when they go through this process?
So, I'll actually say, so technically speaking, BEEV isn't the process they're sent back through. BEEV is the acronym for the company, and it's budget exoplanet exotic vacations, I think it is, if I remember exactly. And part of it was, yeah, I mean, really, part of it was, the way in which corporations use sometimes painfully lame acronyms, but they use them like they're supposed to be cool. And so, yeah, like like calling these people beavers, was supposed to, I mean, it's supposed to evoke like a sense of silliness, of just like this corporate hollowness to it. But so the process through which they travel, though, is something that I have thought decently about. In some ways, it's actually based on Michael Crichton's novel, or inspired by Michael Crichton's novel Timeline. That's the one where Crichton really worked to mesh quantum physics with medieval and time travel with medieval scholarship. And basically, his principle for quantum time travel was that quantum space time is often viewed as what they call quantum foam, and foam by nature is porous, and there's a theory, and it's one that I believe they think they have confirmed, that you could actually send particles through the pores in the foam and direct them to reemerge elsewhere. And I do believe that they have claimed they have successfully teleported individual particles through this method.
What's it called again?
Quantum foam, or quantum teleportation. And in Michael Crichton's Timeline, basically they sort of use that transporter model of Star Wars, where you aren't actually transported, you're just broken down into your constituent components, analyzed, and then reassembled from a new set of components on the other end. So every time you teleport, you actually die, and the person who comes out the other side is a reassembled version of you created on the spots. Yeah, that looks it. Yeah.
Bell State Analyzer. Oh,
Yeah.
this is way over my head.
It's some really it's really interesting stuff. It's I mean, people are seeing the universe in some really wild ways, and we often sort of think about the ways in which we're locked on this planet. It would take us years to move to other solar systems and things like that, but at the same time, we're legitimately tackling, we're looking for ways to cut around the problem. And there's some really promising, I mean, maybe it won't ever come to human teleportation, but it's sure as hell fascinating ideas. And it's just amazing, some of the stuff we're actually able to do. But no, so basically, to me, that couple is actually dead the moment they step on their little enter the little transporter unit. But from a narrative point of view, they still have continuous experience, because as far as they know, when they're reconstructed on the other side, their consciousness is identical. And from what I picture for it too, I also throw in there's a whole bunch of side effects listed, because I've always loved that the trope of the fine print side effects. And
it's on every pharmaceutical commercial. Is hilarious to me.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, so many of them are like, you take this to prevent your cancer from spreading, and the side effect is that your cancer will spread while you shit yourself, and your testicles explode. But
my dad had the occult near fatal bleeding from taking, I'm not going to say the name of the medication, but it's a blood thinner that you take post angioplasty, and sure enough, that shit happens. He almost died.
Oh man, that's scary.
Yeah.
I actually did have an allergic reaction to medication that nearly killed me when I was about 19. So I've always had a little bit of fear about medications as a result. But no, the side effects were, partially for a joke, but also they were a bit of an homage to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and teleporting by pushing the infinite improbability drive, where they'd cycle through all these things they turn into before they finally arrive at their final state.
Yeah, and while the couple are on their journey as beavers, they keep getting these continuous prompts for extra features that require additional credits. And it reminded me of kind of, we're not doing it with this live stream, but kind of like the way live streams have credits involved and tips involved. And like, hospitality and recreational services kind of nickel and dime you to death with extra add-ons. So my kind of obsession with the way technology is going to influence consciousness and just the way we do everything in the uh, upcoming years. Uh, I was curious to know what you thought. Will we go to like pure cryptocurrency, do you think?
Um,
And tell me your vision of a futuristic consumer society.
well, I will actually start with that one. The second part, because that, I mean, to a large extent, that that element of consumerism, that element of microtransactions and everything, where like you get on a flight now, and some of the most basic shit is an add-on, and so that sort of fee hidden cost oriented society is definitely something that the story is playing with, and I find it personally maddening, and sometimes it makes me not want to go anywhere or deal with anything that involves money. um, so, I mean, in the short term, I don't think that we would switch over to cryptocurrency right now. And I think the largest reason why is because, at least in the current global scape, we are still really obsessed with national boundaries and national identities. And I think the nature of a cryptocurrency, unless we were to start having individual cryptocurrencies for each individual nation, and at which point it wouldn't really be any different than what currency is now. Unless we started going that route, I don't see an easy transition to it as sort of a global economic system in the next, I don't know, 10 years. Beyond that, of course, God only knows what things are going to look like. I don't think, I imagine that 2020 to 2024 would look the way it did back in 2014. um,
Yeah.
but no, at the same time, I do think there is going to be a certain point where, you know, I think that underlying economic systems are likely to face a major change. Now, what that looks like, it could vary. I think to a certain extent, cryptocurrency itself is really similar to Star Trek's vision of the credit system. I don't really see how those would be any different, actually. So I mean, it's not like a new concept or anything, and it's oddly combination of both utopian and dystopian in its nature, depending on how these things get used. But one of the things that I was working with in the story, though, and it's both what I think is the funniest part and the darkest element of it, is that initially these microtransactions seem pretty innocent. It's like, hey, would you like to have the more advanced version of the analyzer so you can see what this cloud is made of?
Do you
Um,
like new car smell?
yeah, exactly. And but by the end of the story, literally their life and their death is based on their account balance. You have the character who accidentally gets fined and overdraws his account, and suddenly he can't purchase the life saving intervention, and it has dire consequences. One thing I'll tell you, actually, it's kind of fun. There's an extended version of that
Oh.
story. I actually wrote.
Do I have to give you extra credits to
No, it's the
for
listeners who
for
do.
100 additional credits? You could read the extended version. Damn
um,
you!
no, it's actually something I may well make available on my website, actually, after the release of the book, as sort of a fun little promo. But no, it continues on after the main character, the point of view character, dies, and he ends up in the afterlife, and he's also being faced with paywalls, as he tries to find out what's beyond, and tries to find out whatever happened to his wife while she was still alive, and every single thing is trying to charge him more and more. And it was definitely an idea that like I think right now the reality for a lot of people is that they do make life and death decisions based on their wallets. You have people who don't go to the doctor because they can't afford. In fact, actually, and this wasn't oddly enough an inspiration, but my mother had a stroke back in January, and it was it's a pretty debilitating one. She's in rehab now. She's actually doing pretty well. But one of the major reasons it happened was she had a prolonged infection, which was a major part of what caused the stroke. And my sister,
Remaining inert for a while.
it was no, it was Honestly, I'm not sure how she contracted it, but basically, though, she couldn't afford a visit to the ER, so she went to the Minute Clinic, and they gave her antibiotics and sent her her blood off for analysis for a more accurate assessment of what she needed, and the results didn't come back for 3 weeks. And if they had come back faster, if she'd gone to the ER and gotten them back same day. Um, she would have gotten the proper medication to tackle the resistant bacteria that was causing her infection. She would not have had the stroke as a result. It's not something that's explicitly her fault. It's really she took the cheaper option, and then the delayed diagnosis is ultimately what resulted in the medical catastrophe. So, I mean, that's just one, personal example for me. But oh my gosh, so many people like there's people who have to try to ration their insulin so that they don't die. And people literally die because they just can't afford their insulin. It's gotten better now with the price caps on it, but you know what? 2 years ago, that was a common cause of death for diabetics. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. Circling back to not foreseeing things, like cryptocurrency and the like progressing in the next few years. It's funny how I had Kenneth Wenger on, who was involved in AI development. He develops APIs for companies. I think he's got like a startup that he runs. But I was like, so why is it all of a sudden just blow up out of nowhere? And he's like, well, these artificial neural networks have been around since the 50s. We've been using them, but they just figured out that you can use GPUs to run the shit. Because it requires so much computing power. Then in the past, they could only use it on a small scale. But now that we can have these big monster supercomputer GPU towers like what Elon Musk is developing in Memphis, I think. Colossus is the name of the supercomputer.
I have heard of that.
Yeah. So that was the reason for the explosion. So God only knows what they have. They just haven't figured out how to efficiently run it yet.
Well, I mean, but isn't that so much of science and technology? I mean, people are still making sense of the ideas from Nikola Tesla. And that was stuff that he came up with, 100 years ago. Same with people like Jules Verne and, who really, and, H.G. Wells, who really accurately described future texts 100 years off. Sure, they didn't really think, they thought they were fantastical stories, but at the same time, people looked at those visions and damn near reproduced them. My favorite example of that is, the production of, ion drives. That was a term that was pseudoscience thrown around by Gene Roddenberry. And some people were like, I can see how that would work. And, now we have particle propelled drives.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. It really, I mean, I know there's a certain amount of material that needs to be left up to suspension of disbelief. You don't want to get too technical, but I don't know. It's just the way I am. I love it. Like, what was the name of that movie with Matthew McConaughey?
Oh, Interstellar?
Interstellar. Yeah. A buddy of mine is an engineer, and he was like, I would have to like really, really put some thought into it and study it, but everything in that movie is pretty much mathematically sound.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, God damn, that's amazing. I love it when people do that.
Oh, no, absolutely. Like, I have a science fiction novel coming out next year called Extinction Dream. And one of the things that's sort of its central feature is that a significant majority of the story takes place on a space station in orbit. And the space station utilizes various different, centrifugal units to create different kinds of gravity for different purposes. And then other parts of the station just are straight up zero G. And I did have to take into account things like, what is the spoke distance necessary for a rotating object to be able to create the force necessary to replicate a usable quantity of gravity while also not having significant disorienting effects on the people within it. And all throughout, I had to track where the people were in these spokes and station as they were moving through it, and keep track of what effect it would be having on their inner ears. So if a character was moving from one of the outer rings into the central spoke, at different points in that journey, they would become increasingly disoriented if they stayed there too long. And there's a lot in that story that takes advantage of that, the question of whether the characters are seeing something that's real or not. And I used physics in that case to really and physics and biology to really try to be able to create a very plausible reason that we would not be able to tell the difference between what these characters are experiencing and the reality that should be in front of them.
Yeah, what you were just talking about made me think of that technique that pilots have to use when they reach a certain amount of G's. It's called hooking? Is that what it's called?
That sounds familiar, but I actually don't know
Where they just kind of go, shoo, like start. I mean, I don't even know how to describe what they do. They just start like doing that over and over to keep the blood in their head so they don't pass out.
Makes sense.
Yeah. God, I wish I could remember what that was called. I want to say it's called hooking or J hooking or something like that. But yeah, it's like
That sounds familiar, actually, but I'll have to look into that afterwards, though, because I haven't written anything that involves fast-moving spaceships aside from momentary propulsion. So I'll have to think. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that one.
let's see. In your next story entitled Robot Fish Don't Know They're in Water, a man's father has just passed away, and he is immediately tasked with vacating his father's belongings to make the living space available to the next resident. And one of the things that really stood out for me is the housing situation. It seemed like everyone was crammed into shoebox apartments that they didn't own. And when someone died, there was like this beeline made to vacate the apartment for someone else. And it was all computerized. I imagine probably like an automated AI type system. And I personally believe that at some point in the future, housing will be utilitarian. There will be little to no aesthetics. It'll just kind of be like, eh, at least down here, not in the upper echelons of the wealthy 10%, 1%, whatever they're included in. It'll just be us kind of filed away in these large file cabinets. So, what do you think the impetus for that could possibly be? Do you think there's such a thing as a danger of overpopulation, or do you think that we'll lose enough livable area that will kind of get crammed together?
Well, Robot Fish is set on Mars. And so, and it is in a largely subterranean colony with some glass dome to provide the illusion of sky, which, gets kind of noted on earlier on. But, in the idea of space colonization, I do think that it is going to be very much like the problem faced with space travel, which is once we leave the safety and confines of Earth, or relative safety, I should say, basically space is one of the things that is the single most premium thing in existence. Right now, if you look at the footage inside the ISS, space is extremely limited. If we want to think about trying to create a population that's going to be realistically genetically stable on another planet, we're looking at numbers close to 10,000 as our minimum baseline. So then we have to think, what is it going to take to house 10,000 people in a completely contained habitat or environment to be able to
Now, you're
house?
talking about 10,000 to begin with? Like that's what
Yeah,
we would try and start with?
yeah. I mean, well,
Okay.
obviously, it would be one of those things where initially, obviously, there'd be a seed colony of like 100 people, 200 people trying to pave the way, build the structures to house larger people, a larger population, of course. But our urgent goal would be to create a genetically stable population, because then that's what would make it a permanent ongoing colony with a real future. So even if that takes place over the period of a couple decades, I mean, the sheer process of trying to excavate sufficient territory to be able to house that would be pretty significant, especially when you figure in also there's going to be the logistics of farming, of other occupational spaces and manufacturing. So, it would be, I think, very utilitarianly necessary to have some micro housing, essentially speaking. To me, I'm very much picturing, of course, the main character actually is part of the privileged class initially. His apartment is relatively luxurious because his father was a technological pioneer who is made a significant contribution to the infrastructure of the colony. But once he is vacated from there, he is then put into basically blue collar worker housing. We don't get to see the inside of his new place because he loses all of his possessions. But I actually very much picture some of the micro housing units you see existing in places like China, where literally it's almost like a contained pod that has a bed, a shelf, maybe a platform to for a TV or something like that, and a miniature refrigerator or microwave. There are people who literally live in, like, I don't know, maybe 15 square feet of space or something like that. There's some pretty amazing videos of that sort of almost like hive-like lifestyle. And so yeah, for trying to colonize other planets, and until we figure out a way to truly terraform a surface, which is a whole nother endeavor that would probably take a considerable amount of time. Yeah, I think the premium of space would necessitate it. But then even here on Earth, they talk about our future of battling overpopulation is to get out into the stars. But the thing is literally putting people into space will never happen in sufficient quality to quantity to lower the population of the Earth. If we wanted to move 1 billion people into space to bring our population down to 8 billion, and by the time we're thinking about this, we're really going to be more like 10 billion. I mean, how would we ever possibly take enough people off this surface to be able to send them out, and send them elsewhere? So I think here too, we will face some pretty significant population crises, but unless of course we have some other catastrophic event that severely decimates population, and I don't really want to see that, and I don't think most other folk do. So
Yeah, I'm kind of a minimalist. When I see those pictures, well, let me back up. I lived in a 414 square foot studio apartment at one point in my life, and I was fine. I mean, I lived alone, obviously. It was before I was married, uh, but yeah, like when I see those videos online of people in those houses they make out of shipping containers. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world to
no,
me. I think it's pretty solid, but
oh no,
definitely the more you don't want to live with like 3 people in one of those things, but yeah. So I don't know. Whenever I see that kind of stuff in dystopian movies, I'm like, yeah, wouldn't be that bad. Well, so circling back to the book, your story entitled Don't Look There deals with severe trauma and grief involving a horrendous murder suicide. Hope that's not too much of a spoiler. Do you have experience with trauma that's severe? And more interestingly, if you don't, what happens to you emotionally when you write something so extreme? And if you don't have experience with it, foreign?
So I can't claim to have had trauma that severe. That is about as extreme as as an individual, especially a child, can get. But no, I grew up in a household that the idea of "don't look there" was very salient. I had a very volatile father. He wasn't physically abusive, and I was the youngest, and I kind of escaped a lot of his kind of perpetual anger. Um, but my mom and my sister kind of got the brunt of that, and so for me, I was always creeping around the house, trying not to be noticed, trying not to disrupt things. That sort of walking on eggshells feeling. And so if there was a fight going on, I would just try not to look there. And so in a lot of ways, what I was trying to do was I was trying to take I don't know, about 15 years of anxiety and compress it into a very narrow and tight experience. And it seemed the only, in order to do that, I had to amplify its intensity to compensate for the loss of the feeling of prolonged stress. Which is why I kind of encapsulated it within a couple day period instead of just many years of always being anxious when home. So, yeah, so like long story short, like the short answer is no, I've not experienced that kind of trauma, but, I have a lot of really good things about my childhood. So I don't want to sell it like it was like this perpetually horrendously miserable experience. My mother's amazing. Um, and my sister is also a really impressive person who I absolutely love. And even my like, it's weird because like with me, my dad treated me different than every other member of the family. I was the person he actually tried to be a parent to. Like he coached my soccer team and stuff like that. And I think to a certain extent, I think he felt like if he was good to me, it would negate the other parts. And so but that was really the drive though. It was just it was a way of trying to pour out just years of anxiety. It's one of those things where the story itself doesn't offer a clear or clean resolution to it. It's really just more a realignment of a burden, and I think to a certain extent the things that we drag with us as the heaviest baggage. I mean, there isn't really catharsis for those things. Instead, you just find other ways to accommodate the weight.
Gotcha. Well, your story entitled Where We Leave Ourselves was bizarre to say the least. At some point in human evolution, natural selection made it necessary for humans to molt and leave an ashy carapace behind. And at some point, we molt for the last time. So, what selection pressure brought on the trait of molting into the human species?
Um. So
Was it store bought tanning?
well, to a certain extent, I mean, I think that really, I saw that as a piece more largely about something that would develop in response to actually social pressure. This idea that we need to rely on each other in a complete and total way. Um, I know growing up myself that I really did my own thing most of the time. My sister and I played a lot of board games. I got out of the house to play with friends or play soccer and things like that. But otherwise, at home, I holed up in my room and I read, or I'd sit at at the TV in the bonus room where nobody else would be, and I'd watch cartoons, or and movies sometimes as well. I used to play board games one player all the time. And like I'd make up my own version of it. I had all sorts of like long form role playing stories I'd tell myself. In a lot of ways, I think it's part of how I started kind of coming into the sensibility for writing novels, actually. But no, so when I was thinking about it, I think it's really easy for us to be very, very isolated. In some ways, I think it seems preferable. So I really wanted to, tell this story of reliance, but then also the anxiety that comes with reliance, where they're constantly fretting over the people who are in their molting stage. You never know if it's going to be the last molt. And of course, that's especially true for older folk, but also, for younger folk. And so the first molt is one that's especially scary. And, I was using that to explore the way in which, relying on family, creating and building a family that's important to you also creates a sense of vulnerability.
Well, I know your family can rely on you because I know from the last time you were on the show, you have the one headphone scooted back so you can hear if shit starts going down.
Oh, yeah.
I'm totally zoomed in, but my wife is not here right now. So the dog is on guard duty. I'm all good. But you, sir, you stay
Vigilant.
Vigilant, yes. Well, circling back, your story entitled Moongrave is about two astronauts who don't follow a very tightly knit plan, which is usually a bad thing in a space exploration or space mission. The objective of the mission is to explore a planet for possible colonization because life was becoming untenable on what I assumed was Earth. The really compelling part of the story is that when the protagonist thinks about, folks, we are live, and apparently so is my dog. Oh, somebody's at the door. You're ruining the live stream. Stop it. Okay. The really compelling part of the story is that when the protagonist thinks about going back, he considers the fact that there might not be anything left to go back to. And space isolation has profound psychological effects. How did you explore the mental state of an astronaut faced with such dire circumstances? And were the astronauts currently trapped at the space station when you wrote this story?
So the last part I'll address first, and the answer is no. So Moongrave was written, I want to say 18 months ago. And really, actually, strangely enough, it was partially inspired by David Bowie's song Space Oddity. Um, the here I am sitting in a tin can far above the world.
Yeah.
And I've always been really enamored or very fascinated by the idea of sort of being stranded in space, but not necessarily in that sort of lifeboat kind of way. I think the deeper we travel into the solar system and beyond, I think the more we start looking at the reality that most journeys into space are one way. The logistics of trying to return become increasingly complicated. And even though, I know that like they were talking about like I think it was an 18-month journey or 10-month journey into Mars and then round trip of 25 months or something like that. So can't remember exactly, but I know that like they're speculating now that there's a new type of drive that they think might be able to accomplish the same task in like 3 months, and it's like, wow, that's so cool. 3 months instead of maybe 2 years or maybe a round trip in 6 months. That suddenly sounds so much more feasible until we have to start thinking about the fact that that is still 6 months while being bombarded by solar radiation. That's one of the biggest problems that they have in trying to plot space travel is that the human body is, I mean, we're meant to be protected by our atmosphere. We are ill equipped to that kind of unshielded travel. And sure, you can think of this like, okay, we can build lead shields, but then we have to get lead up there. And that's, it's heavy, it's bulky. And again, physical space is a big problem with space travel. So yeah, I think we'd probably at least in the shorter term, at least, the next 100 years, we probably would be much more invested in trying to find ways to send people one way out there without necessarily being able to return. We'd be more realistically able, I think, to be able to generate food and water on the spot than we would be able to fly home and resupply, or at least land there and wait for the supply ship that was launched right after us, or something like that. And so that was a big part of that story, though, is I really wanted to think about this person who's making a one-way mission. And then it's a question, okay, so who's going to fly out this far, essentially by themselves? Yeah, there's a small crew, but I mean, when you're with like three people for the rest of your life, you better really like those people. And even then, I don't think it's going to be the greatest.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so what's going to cause people to actually be willing to do this for the first time? And then you have, okay, so a crisis is going to drive them. Well, if if the kind of crisis exists that's going to drive them to do that, it also means there's a good chance that that crisis may escalate or change before they ever have a chance to do whatever it is that they're planning to do. And so even from the launch, I wanted them to have, sort of almost like Schrodinger's despair, where they're simultaneously existing in this state where they are trying to do this great thing that's an act of heroism and hope, but that also is the ultimate act of despair, that you're the rat fleeing the dying ship.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of circling back to when you were talking about, I guess, growing up with your father. Your story entitled Quick Rental is about a woman being terrorized by the woman with whom she was formerly in an abusive relationship. And I can't remember if it was physical, but it was definitely psychological, emotional, kind of what you were talking about earlier. And in the story, it almost seems like she has supernatural powers. And so I didn't know if she literally had supernatural powers, or were you kind of producing this commentary or something metaphorical with the way that verbal, psychological, emotional abuse can kind of implant itself into your brain like some sort of parasite and basically terrorize you without the person even being involved.
So with that one's kind of funny in a way because of all of the stories in that collection, that is the most overtly autobiographical.
Oh,
Um, that when I was in my early 20s, I actually had a very aggressive stalker. It was somebody I
really?
had dated, and it ended in kind of a very disastrous and awful way where I walked away and just it was a situation, and yeah, for about I don't know 6 months after that, everywhere I'd go, she'd freaking be there. She'd show up at my house at all hours. Like literally, there was one time I was washing my dishes, and she popped up right outside the backyard, the window in the backyard. She'd show up at work. She'd call me 40 to 50 times a day. And it was an absolute nightmare. And it just seemed like, I mean, like to some extent, I mean, one of my thoughts was like, how are you even surviving? Like, how do you how do you feed yourself while you're doing all of this? So yeah, I mean, there was this element to me, like, I mean, it rather than superpowers, I saw it more as like, as more of a haunting. But then at the same time, and this is the really funny part, I actually lived in a house that had very real signs of haunting, including bleeding walls. A red, viscous, thick fluid would seep out of the wallpaper. The first time we saw it, I had several roommates at the time. The first time we saw it, it was coming out of the chimney, and the landlord came down, and it was funny because he was this big Charles Manson looking fella, and he always
He
brought
wasn't a
his.
he wasn't a member of a cartel, was he? They didn't have bodies in the freaking.
No, he had a hammerhead shark head up in the attic, which was
Oh,
interesting. No, and
wow.
he'd always come by with his giant friend named Spider, who was his main maintenance guy. And so he came up there with us, and he was like, "Nah, nah. Here's what's going on. This is an old house. The bricks of the chimney are starting to separate, and water sometimes will seep in through the chimney in a bad storm, and then it's just washing the soot out through the cracks. And it's like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. I see that." But then it started pouring out of other walls as well that weren't in any way attached to the chimney or fireplaces. And then, we had it was a weird house to begin with. It was very much the house in the story. It was like cobbled together. Its foundation was a very old building, but it clearly had major additions put on it multiple times during its course. And they didn't match stylistically either. So the place had this weird disjointed vibe where parts of the house just didn't match other parts. It was like you stepped from one building into another. Um, like when I moved, like the breaking point for me when I moved out was when I was it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was just going to go to bed, and I'd eaten like a late crappy dinner of like mac and cheese and stuff like that, and I was carrying my plates to the kitchen, and I was just in my socks, and I stepped on a rat in the hallway. And like my foot, like I didn't see it at first, my foot just went down weird, and like immediately I knew something was very, very wrong, and I fell against the wall. And as I fell, I just saw the rat go barreling across the kitchen under the stove, and I was like, "Fuck this place." The bleeding walls are one thing, but that kind of
Mhm.
aggressive vermin is another.
Bleeding walls are kind of cool, actually.
Oh
That's a
yeah,
nice, this nice. If you like horror, it's a nice aesthetic. Like, oh, these are my bleeding walls.
exactly. No, it makes for like it makes a great story. But yeah, like pets in the place would act weird. They'd bark at the corners for no reason. Like all
Uh,
kinds of creepy signs. And but yeah, so like that story is actually really really steeped in my own experience. And the only thing that I amplified was that I actually just tipped it over to actually being supernatural at the end. Yeah. Otherwise, that one is straight from about 3 months of my life.
Oh God. Well, at least it was just 3 months. That's weird though, because I had somebody. I would say they harassed me more than they stalked me. Just wouldn't stop calling over 2.5 years.
Oh wow, yeah.
2.5 years, and that drove me nuts. If they had been showing up, I don't think I'd be able to handle that. One of us, one of us would be dead.
I
I
mean,
think.
it's genuinely freaky. Of the like, I've been in a few scary situations in my life, but that one was probably the one that just had me the most unsettled because it invaded all parts of my life. It wasn't something that just like happened one time where I did something stupid and ended up in an awkward situation. Like this was like I had no way out of it. And it just seemed like this inescapable, omnipresent force.
Mhm. Ugh. Well, enough of that talk. Circling back to the book, uh, your story entitled "The Robots Inside Us" is about a mother and a daughter spending the day together, and unbeknownst to the mother, her daughter knows that her mother is terminally ill. They stop to look at a robot exhibition of some sort, and the daughter proceeds to idealize the robot and robots in general because of their ability to heal themselves. If I remember correctly, the robot on display is kind of taking himself apart, putting himself back together. So, is the girl's idealization of robots a form of escapism, or do you see it as a commentary on the potential of technology to offer hope in dire situations?
Oh, it's definitely both of those at the same time. Because I mean, to a certain extent, I think sort of escape into sort of idealistic ideation, and then legitimate hope for progress. They're two sides of the same coin. I think they feed each other. I think there is an element from the little girl where she's both wiser than she seems at first, at least as far as the mother sees her, but then also she's still also remarkably innocent. She like knows what's going on with her mother. She's been able to pick up on it through whatever cues. Maybe she saw a medical bill or maybe she just overheard a phone call. It never really specifies how she figured it out. But she did. But then on the other hand, she is fascinated with this robot, which in and of itself doesn't really have a point. It's and it's like the presence of the robot is unexplained itself. It's the window is just a trans-dimensional window that opened up, and nobody knows why. They tried studying it for a while, but they couldn't find anything, and so eventually they gave up on it. And so the robot itself is kind of absurd. It's inscrutable. Like we can't any ever really confirm or deny what it's doing. We can only just go on the little bits and pieces we see, and we try to put it in the terms we understand. Oh, it's repairing itself. Oh, it's broken. But what does it even mean for it to be broken? How do we know that that breakdown isn't part of its function? It's kind of actually one of the yeah. That's I was
Do you remember
literally
this
about to
guy?
talk about him.
Yeah, that's exactly what was going on in my head. I was like, I
Uh-huh.
wonder, surely he's seen the robot that died.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. That's very much what I was, what I was thinking about with it. And there's somewhere in this office actually. I have a drawing that was, the original kind of conception of it. I was a pen and ink drawing I did like maybe 15 years ago, and it was a robot in a room full of ducts and conduits, servicing a panel. Um, and it had these like layered masks on its face, so it had sort of this stacked face to it, and that kind of coupled with that exact self-repairing robot as sort of the inspiration behind that robot, actually.
What an artistic vision. I would love to meet those guys.
Yeah,
That's incredible.
I would love to sit and have a conversation with them. It's fascinating
Yeah.
and depressing.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, but isn't that what art's supposed to do, is move you in one way or the other, like really, oh
Yeah,
god.
exactly.
Like, I mean, it's nuts and bolts and, wires and but man, you like if you followed it, you developed an attachment to it. And it's just like, I was listening to Lex Friedman's podcast, and I can't remember who he had on, but it was a guy that was involved with the company that designed the Roomba.
Hmm.
And he said that people developed attachments to those things, would give them names, and when they sent them in for like warranty work,
Hmm.
and they'd call them back, and like, yeah, it's there's something wrong with the motherboard, so it's we're not going to be able to. We're just going to send you a new one. They'll be like, no, no, you send Frankie back. You fix Frankie. I don't want a new one. It's just so weird how you develop an attachment to it, even though it's not conscious.
Well, I mean, I think it's our innate tendency to project ourselves into everything we can. If we see a resemblance in any way, we'll immediately connect to it. No, I mean, it's just like you look at a light socket and you see a surprised smiley face. I mean, we understand the function of the socket perfectly. There's no mystery there. The shape itself, really doesn't have a real physical resemblance to a human face, but we see it. So we project ourselves onto it. We see faces in cars with the headlights and grills. We take inanimate objects like stuffed animals, and we give them names and develop like living stories for them when we're younger.
Mhm.
It's that people will people grow attached to things in really fascinating ways for sure.
Yeah. Well, your story, "May I Take Care of That for You," was probably the most bizarre of the collection. The story centers around a man whose apartment is turned into a birthing center for a strange alien brood by an alien that exhibits the same maternal instinct as a human to nest. Beginning by cleaning the apartment, just walks right in. Doesn't say, well, I think, she, uh, if there's gender involved, I don't know, just makes a noise and walks in and starts cleaning the place. And after the aliens, how should I put it? I guess removal from the premises just is no longer part of the story. The man decides to raise the alien babies. So, what were you attempting to say about human adaptability or the universal aspects of care and nurturing?
Oh, this one was this. I'll admit this is one story that if you want to know what I think is funny, this is the story where I'm like, all right. So one day, this guy he's just lost his family, and to the point where he's still not even like emptying out their house, and he's living where in their old house. And one day he opens his door, and there's this thing with lobster hands, and it wants to give him Hank Aaron's rookie card so that it can clean his house. That like there is an element where I just had a lot of fun putting together some weird and disparate elements. But of course, if it was just the bizarre, it wouldn't have ended up, that story ended up on Creepy Podcast, if I remember right, in their Patreon. And then it's, and it would have been in this collection if it wasn't one that I thought was really important because ultimately, one thing that sometimes does happen, some of my stories, I begin with the human element. So I'll be like, okay, so there's this relationship I want to explore. What kind of weird context can I put that in? And so I'll think about the dynamics first of the characters, and then I'll start thinking about the premise and how the premise can help reflect those things. It's a great example of how Robot Fish came about. We really wanted to write that father son dynamic, and then the dynamic of being displaced into a new place where you feel isolated. Um, but with this one, I did start off very quickly. Like originally, actually, the first scene I wrote was literally the guy answering his door, and there's this thing with lobster hands standing there, and it's like, okay, so what's it going to do that's going to be inscrutable? It's going to clean his house. Well, why does his house need to be cleaned up? And so, at that point, I was like, well, maybe this guy is, still dealing with a really significant loss. Maybe he's processing the death of his parents, and I know a lot of people who have, allowed their places to fall into disrepair, especially since they want to kind of keep it the way their parents had it and stuff like that. And so, I started thinking about this idea of loss. And then also, it really struck me that this guy needed to feel a little bit guilty. Maybe he wasn't quite there when they were alive. And so now he feels like he needs to inhabit their space after they're gone. And then, suddenly, and he is faced with this thing that first off, wants to serve a very parental role in its own ways. It's not just like a nesting role that's, now it's suddenly cleaning up after him. So initially it feels like it's replaced, his parents. But then as it, sort of progresses further and further into his house with each returning visit, he starts to realize that that it's wanting something more. And I think there's a way in which, it's looking at our emotional path from dependent on our parents, and then we start establishing ourselves and building partnerships, and to a certain extent, though, I think we want people that we can rely on. I think, spousal reliance is very different than parental reliance. Of course, or at least I hope it is for most relationships. But no, I do think that, we have a desire to feel like there's someone with us that we can rely on, that, will protect us and we protect them. It's the core of, what we tend to call sort of the definition of the family unit, regardless of things like biology. And, I think also at the same time, family doesn't always look like what you expect it to. Family takes really odd and unexpected forms. Sometimes the people who become really important in our lives are people we never would have expected to matter. And at the end, that was what I really started wanting to play with this, is that I wanted this guy who, for one reason or another, hadn't really understood what his parents meant to him. Now he finds this chance to have a relationship of a very odd sort with this unexpected partner. And he doesn't quite get it then either. And instead, he destroys it. And then, he's left trying to figure out how best to pick up the pieces and move on. And now he does so by creating a third generation, or watching over a third generation. The three generations of that story is really kind of the key to what I was trying to move the reader towards by the end.
Gotcha.
And the title, of course, changes for each of those relationships as well. May I take care of that for you? It's different when it's spoken by a parent, spoken by a spouse, and then spoken to a child.
Very interesting. Well, your story entitled The Cornflake Ordinary is very disturbing. The story is about a man whose cat is killed by his inanimate personal possessions that have somehow become very animated. These possessions range from furniture to articles of clothing. So, were you making and I keep bringing up commentary because I just like see commentary in a lot of these things, but I don't know, maybe I'm just like turning you into like the spokesperson for a generation accidentally, but were you making a commentary about consumerism or our relationship with material possessions? And if so, can you tell us more about it?
Oh, this one absolutely. Of all the stories in there, I feel like this one is probably the one that's the most on the nose with its message. I definitely feel like, basically our narrator, or our main character, has just reached a point where, they realize that their life has been taken over by their possessions. And not only are they owned by their possessions, that like they're sort of psychologically dependent on them. I wanted to create the sense that it was an abusive relationship. If you read through it and you think about the ways in which their behavior is controlled by their possessions, things like not allowing them to speak to people at work, it very much was meant to be a reflection of the way in which an abusive partner would keep somebody confined. Except that, in this case, there's no one else. There is no partner. It literally is the trappings of their life that they feel like they've had to generate.
I'm never wearing a belt again.
Well, have you ever
My
seen
pants are just gonna have to sag. What?
have you ever seen starfish tentacles?
I guess not.
If you
I
take
mean,
a if you take
I've just
a
seen is it like on the underbelly or
Yeah,
something?
yeah.
Oh no, I guess not.
Yeah, if you turn them over, because they walk,
Yeah.
and they have that five-lined mouth up their tentacles, and
Ugh.
so if you take them out of the water, though, these tentacles come out of it on both sides and just start wiggling around frantically,
Ugh.
and that is exactly what I pictured that belt looking like. It was this
Oh
really
God.
uncanny, distressing image, and I was like, "Oh man, that's perfect."
Ugh. Well played, sir. Well played. Well, your story, We Have No Spare Parts, was very reminiscent of the film that we just spoke of earlier in the show, 2001: A Space Odyssey. There were astronauts on board a ship that suffered a catastrophe related to striking asteroid shrapnel. And the onboard doctor, which was a form of AI, is that right? Yeah. Uh, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to speak, was attempting to get him to voluntarily surrender more of his consciousness to help keep him healthy and functional. And I guess, kind of to backtrack a little bit, this catastrophe resulted in some people dying from brain bleeds, I believe. So it made me think of the Neuralink chip and the amazing things it's doing for quadriplegics. On one hand, you have technology kind of inching its way into consciousness with direct contact with the brain. But then there's kind of, this Black Mirror possibility uh, ending happening related to that. So, does this story reflect your views on the future of manned space missions and the integration of AI in these missions? And do you think it would have helped in situations like the one that we have with the two astronauts currently stranded at the space station?
So, there is there's a broader question about technology as a whole. I grew up watching a lot of animes, things like Ghost in the Shell and Serial Experiments Lane, Evangelion, actually, which sort of probes the boundaries of the definition of at what point do we cease being human. And that's always been a question that really fascinated me. What are the boundaries of what we would define a human being to be, especially when we start dealing with matters of consciousness and the world inside. And a theme throughout the piece, it's fairly on the nose in a couple of different spots with it is I really wanted to ask the question, the Zeno's paradox of the ship of Theseus, except with humanity. As we start swapping our parts out, what parts can we do without? How far can we go replacing parts of ourselves until we're no longer human? Could we replace every part of ourselves and still be the same person as long as it happened over time? And to a certain extent, that's where the title comes from, of course. That's definitely a double meaning, where part of it refers to their stranded state, where their ship is damaged and it's set on this permanent outward trajectory, and they lack the spare parts to properly repair it, and the spare parts they do have are steadily diminishing. So you could say, really, they aren't spare parts anymore. That every part, even the spares, are now necessities. And so um, in the other point of view, of course, these characters are trying to figure out ways to survive indefinitely, essentially speaking, because their best bet is to reach a destination of any kind. And so they're trying to prolong their lives as much as possible through technological means, steadily and systematically replacing part after part after part. Some of these people have even gone as far as to upload their entire consciousness into a ship collective, and that's where some of that pressure comes from, that they're essentially wanting our protagonist to join them in that collective. But then also, he is still holding on to the remnants of his body. Right at the opening, for example, they're trying to convince him to replace his blood with more efficient synthetic blood. But he's also thinking, well, I mean, but isn't blood one of those things that's always been seen as fundamentally human? I mean, isn't that why vampires want it? Isn't that why so many rituals involve blood sacrifices? It's always blood, blood, blood. And so it's this one thing that he's kind of almost irrationally holding on to, because it's really more out of tradition and history that he's clinging to it. But at the same time, at what point what point would you be giving up, who you actually were in order to, be this new thing? And what is that new thing exactly?
Yeah. Well, your story, entitled Devil's Voice, is a dystopian story about a man in a rural area with nothing left but his mother to take care of, who is extremely disabled from a massive stroke. And the population was decimated from a disease that was brought back inadvertently from a space mission. And when you think about it, disease spreads from all areas of the world. I mean, uh, even before the pandemic, you had the bird flu, the swine flu, Ebola made a
Mhm.
resurgence, you know. So how is it that we haven't had something from space? And I know that space is a vacuum. It's not exactly a place where anything can grow, but kind of like the premise of your story, there was like this perfect storm of events that facilitated the growth and transfer of this disease.
So, I think to some extent, really luck is the answer to that broader question of how hasn't this happened? No, I mean, of course, it's so much is governed by essentially unpredictable chance. We might look at something like the dinosaurs meteor. An entire 200 million years of evolution was wiped out. Simply by a single meteor strike that at the time couldn't possibly have been foreseen. Nothing would have understood what the hell was happening. Um, but no, I think to some extent, if something like this were to happen, it would be a bad luck draw, where, you're lucky not to have the bad luck, and then if the bad luck happens, then your luck is up. So, it would require, again, some sort of perfect storm to facilitate it. Now, that being said, of course, if we want to get more pragmatic, as we do continue to expand elsewhere into the solar system, as we continue to do additional research in space and actually in orbit and things like that, we do start raising the likelihood that we would become vulnerable to new kinds of diseases, or we would encounter new kinds of diseases that were previously unexpected. I know, for example, if I remember right, they found amino acids, or they believe they found amino acids on a asteroid or something along those lines. And one of the big proposals, in fact, actually, it's the big proposal of we spare parts. We have no spare parts. Is if we mine one of those asteroids, if we bring one of them back, there's like $quadrillion worth of rare and precious metals there. It fundamentally changed the way the planet runs. But who's to say there isn't something else that we don't want coming to Earth on something like this? So the
So
more
so they can find like cobalt and lithium and stuff like that?
Oh yeah,
Or
I know. God, a whole bunch of like famous, wealthy science interested people. Like I know James Cameron was involved in the project, but they've been speculating and trying to find ways to fund a project to bring one of those asteroids back. It would literally collapse the entire global economy, actually, because none of the materials that currently have value would have value anymore. But no, yeah, it would be like, all of the stuff we'd ever need for computing. That they think we might be able to get through some of these things. It's a really cool idea. And yeah, that was the ship's initial goal, and we have no spare parts. And but the more we go out, the more we bring back, the more likely we are to encounter something we don't want to bring back. It's that you know dark forest cosmos look. It's that alien universe existential nightmare universe look. Um, and for me, that particular piece, one of my biggest, contagion has always been one of my biggest fears. I'm not like a germaphobe by any stretch, but, you know, uh, like a mass plague has always been one of my biggest nightmares. So, like, The Stand was always a huge favorite of mine when I was younger, but even more so, actually, Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain was existential, one of the most existentially terrifying pieces I've ever read. Then you couple that with later on reading what's his name, Douglas Preston's Hot Zone. That's just pure nightmare fuel right there. And so I really did. I really wanted to write a piece about plague. It's a subject I haven't really dealt with in any of my work. It's one I actually do. I'm working on the groundwork for a novel that's going to tackle it too. Not the same as in this story, though. But no, I wanted to come up with what I thought would be the cruelest kind of plague that I could come up with. And so, in this one, of course, we have the plague that spreads by thought when you think of your loved ones. Because, of course, what's the first thing that happens when you're seriously ill or injured? And Yeah, you think of, you wish your mom was there, or, that, man, I hope I don't get my wife sick. And, simply by caring, you spread it. And so, yeah, yeah, that was, I think, the cruelest thing I could come up with as far as how this would work. And, Actually, one thing that is weird about that story, I reread it. I was going to record a reading of it because I like the voice of it. Like I'm living in the South, and so I don't write dialect too often, but that one has a really heavy dialect to it, and I thought it'd be fun to re-record to record it. And I was reading it, and when I wrote that, it was before my mother's stroke, and reading it after, I actually really took on a new relationship to that story, and I kind of had to set it aside. And I'm going to revisit that here in a week or two, I think, before the release date. Actually, that's when I want to put a recording up of. But yeah, actually, I sat down. I was like, nope, I can't do this right
Well, I haven't gone through every story, but this is the last story in the book. It's entitled A Scenic Place, and it seems to showcase both the extinction and I wouldn't say the survival, I guess maybe the recycling of the next. I mean, maybe some people survived. I don't know. Seem to showcase both the extinction and the survival of the human species, or at least the new cycle of evolution. Can you discuss how you decided on the order in which the species disappeared? Was there a particular message or ecological commentary you were aiming for?
now. Funnily about this story, this is, the first story in the collection is the newest story. It's the one that I wrote right before I compiled it. So actually, that one was the one that made me decide I wanted to compile it. But the last story, Scenic Place, is actually the oldest story in the collection. It was one of about four stories I wrote back in early 2021 as part of sort of a return to fiction. I'd been working on poetry for quite a while, and I I had these kind of weird, sort of half finished short stories I'd written as a graduate student, and I kind of started brushing some of them up. And one of them actually got published. It was this really goofy story called "The Loneliest Missile," and it was about a surface-to-air missile that was its dream was to accomplish its purpose and blow up in a spectacular fireball over a city of the enemy. But unfortunately, there were so many peace talks and so many delays in the war that the missile never got launched, even as it watched all of its other friends get launched. And then it begins to, of course, rust and to fall into disrepair, eventually shutting down. Its internal guidance chip shuts down, rendering it completely inert. And then a technician comes along and starts, giving its guidance fins one last polish to say goodbye to it. And my goal with that one was to make you feel bad for a surface to air missile, and offer a little bit of commentary, of course, on the absurdity of war. This one, I wanted to revisit that idea through a similar lens, and actually, to me, strangely enough, the main character is actually the bench and the lamppost. I actually see them as the people or the beings that are actually witnessing all of this, and they endure through it. They get damaged in the process. You have the slats of the bench get charred, the lamppost partially melts and wheat and bends down. But I saw them as these things that endure. I've always been really interested in things like the consciousness of trees and stuff like that. This idea that trees themselves, they protect their young, for example. They channel nutrients to their own saplings, for example. And I think I
Not to
like.
mention the mycelium
Oh
networks.
yeah, absolutely. I like that actually is showing up in a future book of mine.
Oh,
Actually,
sweet.
that's
All
under works.
right. Nice.
But no, what does time look like to things that experience the world like this? I think we can think of the point of view of a mouse, for example, and I think we can kind of get into it and have something, not necessarily a real understanding of what it's like to be a mouse, but I think we can kind of conceptualize it a little more closely than we can these things whose lives and internal lives don't look anything like our own. And so that was something I wanted to bring at the core of it. That these two things were put there and they sort of endure through it all, even far into the future, well after this catastrophe has struck. Um, but beyond that, the order of if I remember right, I think it was the fish and then the birds and then the insects, if I recall correctly. And I think if I remember right, I think my thinking was that the most immediate toxins and fallout would contaminate the water. The heat would boil the water, and that would kill the fish. I think then I figured that a lot of the birds would be eating the fish, and they'd also depend on the water supplies, and so they would be the ones that would go down next. The insects would endure a little bit longer, largely because they live underground, or they live in enough number that not all of them are destroyed. But then eventually they too, as the world grew colder from nuclear winter, as the radiation began to further affected them, I figure a good number of them would fold as well.
Well, listeners at home, this is a hell of a book. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for sending me a copy. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And it's coming out when?
So it comes out October 18th, and the pre-sale should be up on September 18th. So 9 days.
So last question of the night, and this is probably directed more towards me than you because I'm the one that's a little on the fluffy side. But from one middle-aged man to another, writing can be a sedentary job. How do you take care of your health and wellness these days?
So the biggest thing actually is that me and the kids. This really started with the kids actually, but it turned out they had adult classes as well. We've been training in Taekwondo. Yeah, we've been at it for a year now, and I'm not gonna lie, it feels freaking fantastic. When I boxed for a little while, or I trained in boxing is a better way to put it. I never got to any actual bouts. I did some light sparring with a couple of the other people at the gym. But that got ended by the pandemic, and I'd always wanted to learn a martial art when I was younger, and the opportunity just never came my way. And then when the kids took an interest with it, we went there to take them for a trial class. One of their friends was in it, so we were like, "Hey, we'll see what it's about, and if you like it." And went to sign them up, and they had a family plan, and it was significantly cheaper for each additional person beyond the first. And so I was like, well, if we pay like
Were there
30.
extra credits involved, or?
But no, I was like, okay, let's give it a shot. And this was back in like July last year, and I found like pretty quickly found that I really missed getting exercise. I actually had put on a decent bit of weight. Like I used to weigh about 155 and got up to almost 180, which was a pretty steep climb. Like I used to never be able to gain weight. And I'm 45 now, and I think that sort of flipped a switch. But no, it definitely helped me manage my weight very considerably. Like I'm back down to 167 to 170 in there, and that's really close to my ideal. I'm really trying to hit 165 and stay there. But at the same time, I also do feel like I'm in, honestly, really the best shape I've been in since my early 20s, because it is a whole body workout. It also, focuses on a lot of things like stretching and, which, the older you get, the more important that is. It's more balance oriented than boxing, which I really like. That's one of those things that if you lose your sense of balance, it's really hard to get it back. So working on that's been really exciting, and then I get to do it with the kids too. That we have weapons class together on Saturday mornings. We're all learning staff right now, and it's just it's something that I get to share with them. Like honestly, life's been extremely busy lately. And so it is nice to be able to force myself to carve time out to make sure I'm always spending time with them every week for this. I mean, there's other things we do together, of course, but it's I like that we're achieving something together in the process.
Sounds great, sir. Well, Andrew, as always, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Oh man, it's been great chatting with you too, man. I'm so glad that you had me on, and thank you for checking out the book.
Absolutely. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about? Maybe reiterate?
Yeah, actually, so I have technically, there's one I won't talk about, but aside from this book, I have two more books directly on their way out. So back in March, I put out a young adult fantasy novel called The Neverborn Thief. About that same time, my novel Gollitok was getting a lot of interest, and I had a fellow named Mark Tullius reach out to me and ask me if I wanted to write for a series that he's got called "Try Not to Die," and it's an adult-oriented choose-your-own-adventure series. It sort of adopts a YA voice for the core plot, but then has adult horror deaths all throughout it. And he asked me if I wanted to adapt Gollitok for the series, and I, I thought about it for a little while, and I ultimately pitched to him an alternate version where instead of Gollitok, I would write "Try Not to Die in the Shadowlands." And basically, this summer, I started working on it, and last week I turned in the full manuscript. I have one round of minor edits to do, but otherwise, we're expecting it to be out by the end of the year. So end of 2024, Try Not to Die in the Shadowlands. I think it's a really fun book. I'm really proud of it. It's the only sequel I've ever written. And then May 2025 is the other book that I've mentioned, the space science fiction book called Extinction Dream. I cannot say how excited I am about having this book come out, because not only is it literally it's been a life dream of mine to write a science fiction horror film. It's inspired by a lot of things like Alien and Event Horizon, a lot of those kinds of things, but also I do think that people will genuinely find it absolutely mind-bending. I think it's both a very straightforward concept to it, but it executes in a way that I think honestly, I really think people are going to be blown away by it.
Nice. All right. Well, that is more than enough to keep us busy. You've been hard at work, sir.
Just doing my best.
Hell yeah. Well, live listeners, thank you for tuning in. Listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Andrew, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, man. It's been awesome.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest writers and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.